Today's conversation is with someone whose life has been shaped at the edge of experience. Dave Pearce served for 26 years as a Royal Marine Commando, deploying globally across some of the most complex operational environments of the last few decades, from Northern Ireland and the former Yugoslavia to Afghanistan, where he worked alongside special forces. He left the Corps as a senior warrant officer, having led and trained commandos in specialist warfare, survival, and leadership under pressure. For the past 18 years, Dave has worked in television and film as a producer, safety consultant, and advisor, predominantly in extreme, dynamic, and hostile locations. He's been involved in around 90% of Bear Grylls' productions, as well as numerous other projects with high-profile presenters and global brands. Beyond that, Dave is a world-class mountaineer and guide. I've been with him. An Everest summiteer, part of the first successful British ascent of, I hope I pronounce this right, Kangchenjunga, without supplementary oxygen, and a veteran of expeditions across Antarctica, Greenland, and the Northwest Passage with me. He's also worked extensively in security, close protection, and hostile environment training. This episode isn't about accolades. It's about what a life like that teaches you, about leadership, judgment, resilience, and the quieter moments behind extreme experience. So welcome to Dave Pearce. Hi, Dave.
Tim, thank you very much.
Great to see you, buddy. And we'll share some of the anecdotes as we go through about some of the moments we've had together in the Northwest Passage and up on the top of mountains.
Yeah.
I want to start with one of the most powerful things I think Dave ever said to me. And we were bouncing along in the Arctic Ocean in the Northwest Passage, and we were talking about climbing Everest. And I think at that point in my life, I still had it as an aspiration that I might possibly want to climb Everest. And David climbed Everest, so we were talking about it. And he said, I climbed Everest twice. And I said, well, I get why you do it once. I mean, after all, that's a major achievement to do it once. But why would you do it twice? And he looked at me and he said, it wasn't hard enough the first time. I needed to do a harder route the second time. That is Dave Pearce. It's got to be hard enough. Oh my gosh, Dave. So when you strip away all the things that you've done, who are you really? Why is it you want to do these hard things?
Well, Tim, hello, and thank you for that introduction. I think starting off with that question is a very interesting one, and it's kind of definitely not caught me on the back foot, but it definitely makes me think. And I will precede this by saying, I suppose I've been someone who is pretty happy stepping outside their comfort zone or trying to do that. And I believe that's important in life and on many levels. And I will sort of preface this by saying I'm stepping outside my comfort zone now by doing this podcast with you, because it's something I have never done and have probably shied away from. So I thank you for that, Tim, pushing me outside my comfort zone, which is great. And I suppose slightly in answer to your question, why go for it? Well, I suppose it's twofold. One, opportunities arise, and it is a sliding doors moment. Yes, I do like challenge and adversity because I think that's where we really grow. But also, it is stepping outside the comfort zone, which, going back to Everest again on a different route with a different situation, appealed to me, and it scared me also. And I guess both the times I was on Everest were very different. One, I was very much embedded in the organization, and for all sorts of reasons, it was a very different dynamic. And the second one was a different route. It was potentially going to be the first ascent, a British ascent of the West Ridge of Everest. And I was going there as a civilian and more on a guide mode, looking after a production team filming the expedition. So that, to me, created some very different challenges, which is the reason I decided to go. It was going to be harder, both technically and within the team dynamics. So I sort of jumped in with both feet, really.
Yeah, and that's an interesting thing about you. You like to do hard things. You like to be outside of your comfort zone, but obviously there's something about being in these tough conditions that you find rewarding, satisfying, exciting. What is it, do you think?
Yeah, what do I find rewarding and satisfying about being cold, wet, and miserable? Whether that's in the death zone on a high 8,000-meter peak like Everest, or in the middle of a jungle or a desert. I love being in those situations with people I can truly trust, truly trust. And I think some of my greatest relationships outside of my wife and family have been built because of those situations. And I probably thrive off that. I think that is a motivation for me to be in those really difficult situations with people I can truly trust. And of course, the other really good thing about it, I think, is it strips away the interference of life. Being amongst nature, which is way more powerful than us and any of us could ever be, all that interference is stripped away. You know, being able to put the kettle on for a coffee, the internet, all this sort of stuff that we're so used to is totally stripped away, and you're back to the bare basics of your own judgment, the way you operate in that environment, the dynamics you have within that team, your contribution to that team, you leading yourself, you leading others potentially. So it's all stripped away. So I kind of feel I thrive on that, and that rawness that the environment can bring you. I just think it's, one, fascinating, and two, I find it quite addictive.
So I totally get the camaraderie element, because I can see that that can help build really open, vulnerable relationships between people, which perhaps are less easy to do in normal life, in inverted commas. But the bit about wanting to put yourself in that situation is an interesting one, I think, psychologically. And when you think about who you are, what is it about you, do you think, that makes you want to put yourself in those uncomfortable situations?
Well, the outcome is fulfillment, I think. The reason to do it is I do enjoy it. Oddly, I do enjoy it. And I think there's maybe a sense of proving myself that I can do it. And even today, I still do lots of physical activity and still climb and mountaineer. And I'm often surrounded by very capable people who are better, faster, stronger, have a different mindset to it. And I suppose there's that slight competitive element, both on a personal level and within, those people that are surround me. But I think going back on a deeper level, my parents were very much let me go out the door and discover stuff. So I think I was always given even as a young boy growing up in Portsmouth, very modest terraced house with a leaky kitchen roof, was allowed to go out and explore and learn and take the knocks and bashes. And I think that's sort of carried me through really in those early days, let alone then joining the Royal Marine Commandos as a young 18-year-old, which, takes getting bashed about to another level. And I just think it got instilled in my blood, Tim. And it's very hard to let go.
Yeah. And it's interesting, isn't it? You grew up in an environment where I suppose that freedom of spirit was encouraged, and you created a positive feedback loop for yourself. The more you did it, the more you enjoyed it, and therefore the more you did it.
Yeah.
That makes sense to me.
Yeah.
Tell me What do you think people misunderstand about you?
Probably out of all that sort of purpose and drive and enjoying something which is quite challenging is, it does come with its failures and its low points. One thing I have learned from it is that you can't have everything. You can't always be the best. You are going to get a kick in the shins from the environment or whatever it is you're doing. And yeah, I think it really has sort of cemented that failure and getting things wrong. And it does happen, whether it's in the outdoor environment or just life in general.
We were chatting before we started about how, you said, I've got this problem with my hip, I have to deal with it. And, I kind of thought that I was bulletproof, and I'm not. I realized that, I have the same fragilities that everyone else has. And I think one of the things that was interesting to me when we spent time together was, spending time with you and Bear, two people very experienced in the wild. I thought, oh, it's great. I'm with two guys who really are bulletproof. And so you're probably right. That is something that's misunderstood about you. That having done so many hard things, people assume, oh, well, he's invulnerable.
It's fascinating, and I'm very fortunate to have the experiences I've had. But one thing I personally think about, particularly the outdoors and nature in general, like I say, it strips away all the interference, and you can really scratch underneath the surface of people and yourself and see those vulnerabilities and see where I've been on the side of mountains and have burst into tears. I've been on the side of Everest. I was on the summit of Everest and burst into tears. Which for someone like me might seem an odd thing to admit. But, I remember being on Everest and reading Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte and bursting into tears. And I think a lot of that is because those environments are very good at, again, stripping away all the interference and allowing something to scratch below the surface of you and see those vulnerabilities. And we're not perfect, and well, I've learned that I'm not perfect. I am very, I'm not indestructible, which I did think when I was a young 18, 19-year-old, and then joining the Royal Marine Commandos. Again, it instills this, in a positive way, in a good way, I think, this indestructibility. But it's not true,
Yeah.
really.
What do you think has remained constant about you over time? What hasn't changed?
I think probably my sense of purpose and my loyalty to projects and to people and teams. I really don't think that's changed a huge amount. I'm a very goal-driven person. I like goals. I like plans. I like the plans for today, and I like the plans for next year. And I like the plans for 4 years' time. I enjoy that. And the other thing I enjoy, and that hasn't changed, is I really like to do those goals and plans with good people I can trust, and a good team, effectively. The other bit that hasn't changed is my inability to be motivated by detail. I like the big picture, I like the plans, I like the goals, but I don't like the detail. And I struggle with that. I find it frustrating because it gets in the way of the plan. It gets in the way of the goals, or it can do. And I'm being slightly flippant, but I guess you know where I'm coming from. And I don't want to say the
Yes.
sort of health and safety word, but as an example, the sort of, the computer says no type thing is something that I struggle with. But again, your question about the consistent, that is also consistent in my life. I still get slightly annoyed and aggravated by the computer says no type attitude.
Yeah. What about self-discipline? Has that always been a fundamental part of who you are?
In a short answer, yes. Self-discipline is very important to me. And, I do a lot of consultancy, or have done, around high performance in teams and leadership. And I think part of the leadership stuff is also leading yourself, which probably is the self-discipline part. I wouldn't say having a wayward childhood. Not. I was a little bit rebellious as a kid. I liked breaking rules. I was naughty, but I wasn't, criminally naughty, I suppose. But when I joined the Royal Marine Commandos, it gave me this level of self-discipline that I never knew existed. And I think it stayed with me, and I was very comfortable with it, exceptionally comfortable with it. And because it's probably something I had in my blood anyway, and that has definitely been consistent even today.
If we take it back to your childhood and your family environment now, and we think about how that might have shaped you, what sort of emotional environment did you grow up in?
Gosh, it's taken me right back, Tim.
It's not that long.
No, it's not. Thank you. Well, emotionally, I'd say it was very safe, my upbringing. I was born in Portsmouth, in Fratton Park. Like I said, a sort of terraced house kid in Fratton Park with a father who was away a lot. He was in the Royal Navy. So my mother sort of had the reins to bring my brother and I up, who, we were pretty sort of crazy kids, I suppose, not in a bad way, but sort of very usual kind of exuberant, two young boys, charging around. I was out the house a lot, but it was a very safe emotional environment. When my dad was present, he was great. He was brilliant at taking us in the outdoors, and on some level, I'm sure where I've got my love for that from. We were always out and about. Our holidays were never lying on a beach. They were always in the mountains. They were always in the woodlands, yomping up mountains and swimming in lakes and all that sort of good stuff. And he was very, very good at that, as was my mum in supporting that. So I think, in terms of the psychological safety of my childhood, it was very good. And as I sort of alluded to earlier on, that I was given a lot of freedom to walk out the door and just be out of the house all day. We used to cycle over Portsdown Hill. I'd be banging on the doors of farmhouses, asking for jobs, which I'd get, humping hay bales around, milking cows. And I just thrived on it. And I'd come home at, 8 o'clock in the evening. It was dark, on my bicycle, and eat dripping on toast and massive slabs of homemade cake. And it was pretty wonderful, really.
Sounds like Enid Blyton's stories.
Yeah.
And was it a warm, loving environment? Were they disciplinarians? Were they hard in any respect?
Yeah, they were. My dad was pretty tough. He was a tough Royal Navy officer. I remember my dad telling me that when he joined the Navy, they were still in hammocks on board a ship. And I remember that. That was like, what? I mean, who lives a life like that?
Yeah.
And he was very tough and disciplined, but very warm. My mum was a cold fish, definitely. Yeah. She was not like that. And albeit she was a great provider, I suppose, there was always food on the table and it was great, and had a warm bed, but she was very distant and was never one to sort of cuddle you and sort of tell you off or tell you how good you were, or how displeased she was. She was pretty consistently unemotional, really. But
which is interesting, because she was your primary carer.
For sure.
And your dad was away a lot, as you said.
Yeah.
So you didn't maybe get a lot of emotional feedback from her.
No, definitely not. Yeah. And I don't mean that in a derogatory way. It's just the way it was. And I never know to this day what stuff she may have gone through in her childhood. I never knew. And, I never really had that conversation as a young lad, because come 14 or 13 years old, I was sent away to boarding school, which sort of shaped some life experiences, and then went straight from boarding school to join the Royal Marine Commandos of 26 years. So I suppose my home life was quite short, but not disastrous in any means.
No. And you and I share that we both went to boarding school, and it definitely makes you emotionally independent
Yeah,
at an early age. So perhaps both of us, when recounting it, would not remember it in a negative way, but I think a important way in terms of the way it shapes our personalities.
definitely. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think I reflect back on life thinking, well, it might not be the choice of some parents to send their children to boarding school, for example, but it certainly isn't the choice of my wife and I with our children for our reasons. But I reflect back onto my time and
Yeah.
I pull some really positive stuff out of it. And in part, I wouldn't have done or do the things or be where I am today if I hadn't had those experiences, good, bad, or indifferent.
Yeah. Yeah. So again, you and I share that. I'm not sending my children to boarding school either, even though I would feel the same way about the experiences that I've had. And
Yeah,
perhaps that's something cultural has changed as opposed to, anything negative about the boarding school experience. Sort of moving on, what do you think you absorbed without being taught? What do you think you naturally absorbed from your environment, your early life environment?
well, I think that a sense of purpose, really, and I guess with not having much in my early days, is that you kind of had to go out and get it. There wasn't going to be someone knocking on the door of number 26 Francis Avenue, Fratton Park, Portsmouth, to say, "Here you go, Dave. Here's a job. Here's life. Here's some values. Here's some experiences." They're not going to do that. So
Yeah.
you have to get on your bike, like I probably did, cycle over to Portsdown Hill, and knock on some farm doors and ask for a job. And I suppose metaphorically, my early days taught me things like that.
Yeah.
And I think moving on, and there's probably more to that I did pick up on, but I think certainly when I joined the Royal Marine Commandos as a young schoolboy and boarding school, I was an academic, but sport wise, I was good. I ran cross country for Hampshire County as a young lad. I played very high standard of squash as a young boy, and I used to slightly embarrassingly win all the sports trophies at school, and it was quite individualistic, I suppose. I didn't realise it at
Yeah.
the time,
Yeah.
but when I joined the Royal Marine Commandos, suddenly there was this whole new world around teamwork
Yes.
and other people around you, and how your actions can affect other people within that team.
Yes.
So I massively absorbed that sense of teamwork from an early stage of joining the commando.
And this is a really interesting point, actually, because I think you said two things that were quite profound to me in that little piece there. One was that it was embarrassing that you used to win all the sports competitions, which is a really sort of anti-ego type of comment. I think there was a recent study in literature about the use of the pronoun I and how it has massively increased in the last 30 years. The number of times I is now used when people write has changed dramatically, and we are in a society which is much more apparently about the I rather than the we. And the second thing you said was about the profound impact of joining the Royal Marine Commandos and suddenly realizing the power of we, the power of that collective community. And it's worth, I think, just emphasizing, because there are probably people who'll listen to this who'd be thinking about joining the Royal Marines or the Royal Marine Commandos or other military units. What was it about that was rewarding?
Another great question, Tim. I felt comfortable in it first up, and not everyone would, but I felt comfortable in that environment right from the get go, pretty much. But I think on a sort of untrained level, because you do get extremely well trained in the Royal Marine Commandos, but on an untrained level, I suppose on an emotional level, there was that huge sense of we, which you mentioned. And I really felt comfortable with that. I really felt that because the team does win in the end, like the good cohesive team does win, particularly in the Royal Marine Commandos, for example. And you could say the same on rugby pitches or football pitches and stuff like that. But, and I really felt a sense that I became hugely motivated by the sense of team and my contribution to that team. And going back to your first point, it definitely wasn't about I. Because in that environment of the Royal Marine Commandos, if it is about I, you will not win. It's not an environment where it's about you. And in fact, one of our big sort of part of the spirit and values is humility and unselflessness. It's your oppo first, it's your team sort of second, and you last.
Yes.
And that's a hugely powerful thing. And interestingly, it's not taught, it's just the culture that is there that you sign up to, sort of metaphorically. So I felt very comfortable with that right from the get-go. You talk about ego because, again, it's an environment where you do have to have a bit of an ego. And I think a bit of ego is a good thing. But if your ego is so much that it overshadows your sense of team, then you're going to get buried.
You and I did an expedition together, me as a sort of paying tourist, really, with a group of 4 people who knew what they were doing, crossing the Northwest Passage from the North Atlantic to the North Pacific. And we spent a couple of weeks together on a tiny little rigid inflatable boat, not much more than a dinghy.
Yeah.
And it was a super interesting experience for me because I had really done no expeditions, no boating of that sort of nature. We were, I think, 2,000 miles in 2 weeks. And, I kind of at the start thought, well, I'm just going to be a burden here. I'm not really part of the team. The team is the 4 people who know what they're doing, and I'm just really a sort of baggage, if you like. And actually, the skill that both you and Bear as team leaders had was to recognize what I had that I could contribute that made me a functionally useful part of the team. And suddenly I went from thinking I'm just baggage to thinking, oh, I'm actually part of a team and can contribute and help make this trip successful. And I personally found that a very rewarding experience. And I think that's something that a lot of people don't understand about team dynamics. It's not just the sort of overall functionality of the team, but it's also making everyone feel that they're a valuable part of the team.
It's a great example, actually, on many levels. And I feel very fortunate. I've been part of some incredibly high-performing teams with, amongst them, very incredible high-performing people. And I've also been involved in incredibly dysfunctional teams. To your point, Tim, I think a really good team, well, I know a really good team, it's not having the ability, it's super open arms about new members joining. You were part of that team. To me, the background, the ability, everything else is minutia. What matters is the contribution you make, and everyone will have, a sandwich to bring to the picnic, whatever that might be, whether it's on an emotional level, physical level, a skill level, whatever. And it's all of us mucking in together from day one without any judgment of backgrounds or stuff like that. And, I think that's hugely important because how can we get people to grow if this team has got such a big ego that it doesn't want to open its doors to allow other people in who haven't been part of that team, who might not come from similar backgrounds or whatever it might be. How can we let people grow? You have to embrace that, and I would hope that's the experience you had, that we're just all buddies in a pretty austere environment trying to survive, basically. I've got a great
Yes.
lasting memory of that, from that trip, Tim, of particularly you and I. And you talk about, yeah, I mean, you're definitely never baggage. That's definitely never, ever the case, certainly in my mind. But one of my great last, and I still talk about it today when I do after dinner talks or event talks or whatever, and conversations come up, and an example of what you just described, or people ask about teams and bringing sort of new people in, for example. And I say about the Northwest Passage and how I remember right from day one where we were going through sort of shotgun drills in case we encountered polar bears.
Yes.
And then we got off on that last beach after that, you and I helming the boat in that horrific sea in the
Yes.
Beaufort Sea, and you and I on that helm, sweating quite profusely because it was pretty full on, and actually having a few giggles and
Yeah.
laughs. And I remember
Yeah.
that so vividly, thinking it's so good that we could come together in that short, and you just saying what you're saying, that we could then be thrust in probably one of the most crucial parts of that trip to try and navigate through the Beaufort Sea in order to get to that little inlet.
Yeah.
Where you went ashore and came running back over the hill saying, I've just seen a bloody grizzly bear, without the shotgun.
without the loaded
I
shotgun.
know,
Yes,
but
exactly.
I think it's wonderful, and teams
But I think that's
at your
I think
peril don't allow new people in. At your peril, don't allow new people in, because you'll crash and burn.
I think I want to drill into this a little bit, because I feel that a lot of people who will listen to this are people running teams, building teams, or who will do that in the future. And it's something I think that we can all really powerfully learn from you. So in the example that I gave, you had 4 people who really knew their stuff, who had been on, a number of similar types of experiences and knew how to cope with the difficulties that lay ahead, knew what lay ahead. And you had one individual who apparently came without the skill sets or experience or, talent to cope with that situation. And your reaction was not, oh, this person is really surplus to requirements. Your reaction, and Bear's reaction, was, let's make this person feel that they're a really valuable member of this team. And the way we do that is by sharing our knowledge, sharing our insights, sharing our experiences, doing things like the shotgun drills that we did, and making that person feel very quickly like they are someone who other people are depending on. And it was a great example, I think, of how you take a person who doesn't apparently have all of the necessary skills and experience and actually make them a functionally useful contributor to a team. And it's something that people with managing teams or building teams all over the world face every single day. And you obviously faced it when you were in the Royal Marine Commandos, and people's lives depend on the performance of other people in the commandos. How do you train people in that environment? How do you make them feel part of the team? How do you get them to have that sense of responsibility and accountability? How do you get them to care?
I'm going to say it's the $1,000 question, but it's probably not in many ways. And there's probably far more knowledgeable people to answer that than myself. But the experiences I've had around that, I've got a bit of a mantra when it comes to that, and it's do the basics well. So take our example on the Northwest Passage. It's straight away you're a friend. It doesn't matter. We're going into an austere environment. There's polar bears, grizzly bears, horrific seas, super cold temperatures. We're in the middle of nowhere. If there's an accident, getting evacuated is going to be a long, drawn-out process, which could compound any injury, and so on and so on. So the consequence of not trying to bring someone in to be a team player is at your peril. Now, you could relate that to a rugby pitch, whatever, and even within the Royal Marine Commandos, which, as you rightly say, is hugely driven by cohesive teamwork. But I go back to that little mantra, is doing the basics well. And I suppose your example of the Northwest Passage is, in my mind, okay, Tim, let's start with a few things about the boat. Let's start with a few things about this. This is the environment we're going into. These are the challenges. This is a good way to layer yourself, to keep you warm, wet and dry routines, whatever it might be, and shotgun drills. What happens if we're in our tent, wrapped in our sleeping bag, and you can hear the snorting outside of a polar bear? Now, I've used a lot of shotguns and know that, so I could have just owned that, I suppose, and just thought I was the subject matter expert for any polar bear encounter. But actually, no, we all have to be able to do it. So come on, Tim, let's go and do some shotgun drills, and what happens if the polar bear is outside, and what we're going to do, and how quickly we're going to react. We got our shoes in the right place, our laces are tucked away, so we can slip into those boots straight away and get out the tent and do the business. And there's an education for your people within the team, but just doing those basics well are so important in those early days of team cohesion. And on the top of that, you build all the other good stuff that teams do. Your skill level grows. You have unwritten rules, and you have your laughs and your ups and downs. But I think doing those basics really well, being really inclusive with those new team members or the new team member, straight away putting your arms around them is so important.
So one of the things that was powerful to me was communication. And even though I might not have known a huge amount about some of the aspects of our expedition, you and Bear were always, and in fact all 4 team members were always incredibly diligent about sharing information with me. And so I felt, well, number one, I trust these people. They know what they're doing. And number 2, they're always sharing with me. And if I contrast that with the business world, often we see styles of leadership where information isn't shared transparently, always. And sometimes, for some people, they use information as power. They will actually withhold information because they think that their position in a negotiation, for example, is improved by not sharing that information. Now, I'm guessing that that sort of thing is very dangerous if that happens in the commandos, because that can really put other people's lives at risk. How do you avoid that happening?
Great question. I guess I've been quite fortunate, having sort of had my experiences with teams in pretty austere environments around the world, in all environments, from jungles to mountains to the sea to the deserts. And I've also sort of dipped my toe in quite heavily to the corporate world, whether it's doing some consultancy around high performance in teams, leadership, or wherever it might be. And it is interesting. And the thing is, I think, Tim, at the end of the day, one thing I have learned is that there's incredibly talented people throughout all the sectors, whether it's at private schools, boarding schools, public schools, comprehensive schools, the Royal Marine Commandos, the RAF, corporate businesses, incredibly talented people. Now, there may be good cause to withhold information. There may be good cause, but I think it becomes toxic when that information is held in order to increase or elevate someone's status within the business, or indeed to be used against somebody at a later date. And that sort of strategic thinking about withholding information, I believe, will come around and bite you in the backside in the long run. So I understand how in all environments, sometimes withholding information can be a positive thing. The skill of the leader and the skill of maybe the team, however you look at that, is to decide which bit of information is important to release at the right time in order to get the best outcome. I have no problem with that because we've all done it, whether it's in the Royal Marine Commandos, whether it's in the corporate world. Like I say, the issue is when it becomes toxic, when it's used at a strategic level to undermine the company, to undermine people within the company, the team, or the business. But to me, it's not sustainable. It will always come out. And we had a great saying when I was serving, and it was called an all-informed net. So a net was like everybody within the radio communications sphere, whether that's verbal communication or with sort of combat type radios. And it was called an all-informed net. So like everybody knew at the right level, they had the information, the equipment, the intelligence they required in order to do their job. Now, that could be different for the CEO, i.e. the bigger intent that the CEO has, or the general or the colonel. That information is a bit different from, let's say, what a corporal or sergeant has. So the information they need to know what a higher intent is, but they might not need to know what the political intent is. But they need the information in order to do their job. Now, I don't think that's being strategic in withholding information. That's just being smart. But like I say, Tim, I think when it becomes sort of toxic in terms of strategic to undermine people or the business, then that becomes a problem.
Agreed. And we both know it does happen.
Yeah.
And probably it also happens in the commandos sometimes.
Yeah.
How do you, I mean, obviously you have very rigorous training that you go through when you, when you apply to join the commandos. And as you said, a lot of what you learn is the value of the team and the camaraderie and reliance you build on each other. But is there a way in which you try to avoid people using information for their own personal benefit? How do you avoid that toxicity?
Well, using the Royal Marine Commando as a point in the case you're right, it does happen. And albeit I'm very biased to the Royal Marine Commandos, it shaped me massively in my life. I believe it's a very high performing organization. However, it's not without its faults. And they're always trying, and any great high performing individual or organization is always striving for excellence, always looking to improve. And yes, on the rare occasion in my 26 years, there were times where maybe information was withheld, but it certainly wasn't on the battlefield, so to speak, because that would be dangerous. It's more sort of in a peacetime role or on courses, for example. But the thing about the Royal Marine Commandos is you can't hide from it. It will catch you up because it's a very small organization that's high performing. And the drums start rattling. If you consistently do that, you will be called out. You will be called out big time. And you do not want a reputation. So, for example, and it's interesting, isn't it, how in terms of high performance, and again, I'm very biased to the Royal Marine Commandos. However, there are these unwritten rules that go on. You're not taught it. And the point in case, there's a thing that if you get a nickname of being Jack, Jack, that is not a good label to have. And basically, being Jack is exactly what you're saying, Tim. It's withholding information. It's doing things for yourself before others in the team. Now, if you get a label of being Jack, that can follow you throughout your career. And you don't want that label, really. People might say it in jest for a bit of fun and a bit of humor and a bit of leg pulling. But if it's serious, it's not good. Now, it's quite interesting because that's never taught. When I went through commando training, no one ever gave us a lecture on being Jack. But it is this unwritten rule. And so I think in that sort of world of high performance, it can happen, but you will be called out on it very quickly by somebody.
Yeah, so that's interesting. That is a cultural solve to the problem, which is accountability. In a high performance organization, people look at each other carefully and measure each other and are not afraid to speak out if they see behaviors that are not beneficial to the team as a whole.
Yeah.
That's what you're telling me.
Yeah. Very well put.
Very, very interesting. I want to talk a bit about values, Dave. We haven't touched on this, and I think this is a super interesting part of who you are. So my first question to you is, you've been in a lot of life-threatening situations, in a lot of dangerous environments. I want to know what values you have that have survived contact with real life. Not the ones that you sort of ideologically might be drawn towards, but what has sustained you in your darker moments?
Well, there's a number of things. I suppose biggest ones are the trust I have in people. Maybe slightly to my detriment, bordering on being a bit gullible sometimes. I trust people very quickly. And I still believe that's a strong value of mine. And loyalty, and take the family side out of it, my wife and children and all that sort of stuff, on a wider level in work, business, expeditions, is that loyalty to the boss, loyalty to the team, first and foremost, and then sort of down the scale, loyalty to myself. And I think those two sort of values, along with having purpose in life, are still very much there. I'm also very much sort of philosophically, I suppose, have some values around you can't have everything. Life sometimes isn't decent to you. So I think those sort of values, I still do very much live by those. Yeah.
When we spent a lot of time together over those 2 weeks, I saw something else in you, which was, perhaps best described as when you were tired or afraid or whatever the environment we were in, there was nothing that seemed to make you feel low. You seemed to have this ability to keep your energy high, to keep your optimism, to keep your eye on the next thing that needed to be done. And I guess that's probably a lot to do with your training that you went through in the commandos and that sort of environment. But you seem to have that sort of drive to keep going, whatever was being thrown at you.
I think that's very true, and I guess I've sort of been told that to my face a few times. And that optimism, I do enjoy. I do enjoy that optimism, and go back to the start of the conversation about the struggles that are going on in the world at the moment, and how some people kind of maybe sort of struggle with this, that, and the other. Is I've always really tried to anchor myself around optimism. And I think that's really important, not just generally in life, but also in my sort of job as expeditions. Let's take the Northwest Passage. You always have to keep thinking what the final goal is and how they're going to get there, which ultimately is to come away from that alive, still as friends, and having a great experience and done the right thing, whatever the message was being put out. So that optimism, I think, can keep you alive, and it also shapes decision-making on many ways.
Yeah, interesting. I was wondering, maybe I know the answer to this already, but what value do you think has cost you the most to live by?
It's great having this conversation because it does make you reflect back on things. And outside of the Royal Marine Commando, which I was very comfortable in, and I felt very sort of happy being under extreme pressure in dodgy environments where there was away on operations, and in very austere places with very little food, no communication back home, and away for months and months and months on end. I could handle that. I could handle the difficult situations and felt very comfortable with it. But where I hit my lowest ebb was when I was doing television, which sounds a bit crass considering.
Yeah.
But the example I was going to give was I was flying all over the world putting these shows together, and they were very complex shows with quite high risk in tricky environments, very remote jungles, wild animals, helicopters, ribs, quad bikes, people, local people, dodgy local people, tribes, you name it. And I was all over the world doing stuff. And I'd flown around the world a couple of times. I was ended up in China putting a show together. And suddenly we had a call through saying I had to get to Alaska because the then President Barack Obama had accepted to do a show with us. And I was literally in China in this very remote place in some province, literally just downloaded all my emails, checked into my room, and then was told to get back on a plane, fly to Beijing, Beijing to Anchorage, Anchorage to a little town called Seward, and put this show together on my own in this place. Now, there was a lot of pressure. I've been away for a long time from my family, but it was the job. Now, it wasn't long after that where I sort of put my hands on my head and burst into tears and was at a very, very low ebb, a very low ebb. I had bad burnout as it happened. And that was because I put all my eggs into this loyalty basket, doing stuff for everybody else, but not my family or myself. Well, it nearly did destroy me. And I had bad burnout. I had the best job in the world on paper, but I hated everything about it. And the loyalty didn't flow both ways. So that was tricky. And so I suppose that's the best example of the question you asked there, Tim.
Well, I think it's a great example of the question I asked, but also it tells us a huge amount about you, which is you frequently will put your obligations to your friends, your colleagues, the team, you will put those at a higher level than yourself.
Yeah, I have done for sure.
Yeah,
I have done for sure.
A lot.
Yeah, a lot. Yeah, and
that is partly loyalty, but it probably is also something else, probably something deeper about you and about your own sense of self. And maybe I'm no psychoanalyst, but maybe that's something to do with the sense of fulfillment that you get out of being loyal. Your sense of value that you get from that, and maybe you get a greater sense of value from that than you do out of doing things for yourself.
100%. Yeah, I do, and I still do, and I do like doing things for myself. I like my quiet space. I like to go on my mountain bike on my own and have my own thoughts. But I am motivated by that loyalty, and maybe that comes from serving in the Royal Marine Commandos, where, like I say, humility and selflessness is very much a huge part of the culture. It's your buddy first, your team, and you come down the pecking order. And I think I've carried that on, but I do enjoy it. I do find it purposeful, and I'd like to think I don't have an ego like that, which probably if I had a huge ego, I might be the opposite of that.
So on a slightly different tack, has there been anything that you failed at which taught you something more profoundly perhaps than success could have done?
Lots, yeah. Quite a number of, I mean, let alone backing off many big rock climbs or mountains and not getting to the top, or, I've been at the bottom of rock climbs in Devon where are well within my capability. And I've said, do you know what? Nah, not today. Maybe that's not a failure. Maybe that's more about judgment. But I think one of the early early sort of failures, I suppose, I I was sort of pushed by my commanding officer to become an officer. I wasn't an officer in the Royal Marines. I was a warrant officer, which is sort of the highest you can go as a non-commissioned officer. But my commanding officer sort of was keen I applied to be an officer. Looking back, it wasn't really in my heart, but he was a really good boss, a colonel, exceptionally good. So I sort of trusted his judgment and went for it and went down to this thing called the Admiralty Interview Board and promptly failed it. Well, actually, I passed, but I wasn't selected. But I didn't become an officer. Now, I suppose there was a slight sigh of relief because of it, because I didn't, and I still to this day do not think at that time I would have been an effective officer in the Royal Marine Commandos for other reasons we could discuss or not. And I just didn't think, and I still believe that today. I think I was a reasonably effective warrant officer and sergeant major, but that really sort of cemented to me that there's a little bit about being honest with yourself and trusting your gut feeling. And I still thank my commanding officer for pushing me to that. It definitely is not his fault. I thank him to this day for doing that. Sometimes really trusting your gut feelings, if we're talking about you as a person and doing your things. I really think it taught me a lot about trusting my own personal judgment about me.
And what was it about becoming an officer that made you feel uneasy and that you weren't the right person to do that?
Great question. And I think I will answer it by going back to right at the start of the conversation where I said I was pretty goal-driven, or am pretty goal-driven by purpose and love to get to that goal or mission or whatever you want to call it with a really good team. That's what I really thrive on. Ask me the detail and the computer says no, and the bureaucracy, that's where I struggle. And being an officer, okay, you are leading, but the officer roles I would have gone into, I would have been lucky if I got a command job. It would have been more about writing policy, writing governance, which I would have struggled at. Sat in front of a computer doing a bunch of rules, which I want to break myself, which I can't. I probably wouldn't have been very good at.
Now, I know, when we chatted in advance, we said we wouldn't obviously touch on any particular missions because some of them have been very sensitive. But I want you to put yourself in a situation on any one of the missions where you had a really tough decision to make, a decision that potentially could cost the lives of your team or maybe the adversary, whatever that situation was. And I want you to think of one that really changed you in the aftermath of that decision.
We were in a base and we got bombed basically very early on, within like a day and a half of being there. I might have been the first night. And going back slightly, I was put in a position of command. I had a small team of about a patrol, what we call a patrol, which was about 6 guys. And I was in charge. I was put in charge of that. And it was my first time on proper operations. And we had this incident very early on. And I had to make the call of what to do, which, in order to keep my small team safe. So you're having to think tactically and to try and do the right thing in order to keep them safe. And that was quite profound. And coming out of that and really realizing the sense of responsibility I had, along with other people in the same position of me with their own patrol team, was the sort of weight of responsibility as a young 25-year-old male in the Royal Marine Commandos was massive. And I remember chatting to my mate, Molly McPherson, afterwards. I came back and I was a little bit ratty, a little bit short-fused. And a great friend, who still is a great friend of mine, Molly, he started taking the mickey out of me a bit. And I snapped at him and almost had him up by the pals. And it wasn't that we were dysfunctional, not at all. We were a hugely highly functional team. And he's like, all right, Dave, he says, and we had a chat about it. And I remember saying, bloody hell, Molly, this weight of responsibility is huge, because the environment we're in, there was people like you and I, sort of white males and females, who were the enemy, basically. And it was very hard to distinguish, and our sort of rules of engagement were very tight. And if you got it wrong, you could end up in court, basically. So that sort of weight of responsibility became very profound. And I must have handled it well, because I went on to get promoted right up to as far as I could go as a non-commissioned officer. But I remember that conversation. I remember that time, and I remember that sort of sense of taking on responsibility and really owning it. And it was pretty profound, and also being able to speak to someone about it.
And if you think of the before and after, so before, you perhaps didn't understand as vividly what being responsible for people in life or death situations meant, and then suddenly you had this sort of profound realization of this is on me. How do you think that changed you?
I think it actually made me more motivated. I was very comfortable in that environment, both whether it was a really complex and ambiguous environment, where you are in operations and it's very difficult, and you don't have much, you don't have communication back home. The rations and the food is austere, and your team, your equipment, your weapon, your team, everything comes before you and your sleep and your own well-being. And it really put in perspective how important that is in an operation environment, and generally in life. I think sometimes, I think we get too used to too many comforts. I think living for a bit of hardship is good, and realizing you can go without breakfast and lunch and it's not going to kill you. But I think that real sense of responsibility and being responsible for your responsibility and taking ownership of it became very profound for me in those early days.
Do you think people need to get out of their comfort zones a bit more often? Most people do.
100%. Yeah. Huge believer in that. I think, I do. And for all sorts of reasons, I certainly on a level of leading yourself. And as I sort of alluded to earlier on, that sort of getting out of your comfort zone is where you do really find yourself, and people find you. Some of the best experiences I've had have been when I've been at my lowest ebb with people around me who will say, come on, Dave, let's keep going. Or here's this, let's keep going. Because the next day they're at their lowest ebb and I'm helping them along, or, cleaning their weapon or sorting their kit out or helping them with this. It's great because it does make the comforts that we have in life so much more amplified. But I think you have to go through a bit of austerity and, hardship in order to appreciate that, which I know is cliche, but I do think it's important, and it does make you realize the important things in life, which again I know is cliche. I'm not into fancy cars, for example. I've still got a Renault Scenic, which I've had for 15 years. I'm not interested in anything else. I think a bit of hardship and resourcefulness has sort of taught me that those material things aren't important.
What relationship would you say in your life has shaped you the most, either positively or painfully?
Putting my wife and family aside, which I would immediately say they're the ones that have shaped me, certainly when they've been in my life. I think prior to that are some of the role models I've had, let alone the experiences. A number really, but two in particular was my grandmother on my dad's side, my dad's mum. Amazing woman, absolutely incredible. And I still think of her today and her level of resourcefulness. She lived to about 98, lived through the war, lost her husband very early on through cancer, lost one of her sons, my uncle, who I never knew. He was a fighter pilot in the RAF, had a crash, died. And her ability to, inverted commas, soldier on with a smile through what must have been unbelievable grief and lived a very humble life in a top floor flat in Weymouth. And the stories she used to tell me, the things she used to do, we used to go on holiday there, and a quite remarkable woman. And I've always held her resilience and her cheerfulness in adversity really close to my heart.
Yeah.
So she would be certainly one. And then I think another guy who, once I got my green beret as a commando and went to a commander unit, or one of our commander units of the 3 commando units we have, 4-5 Commando, and I was very lucky to be put in a team with a guy called Jim O'Connor, and didn't realise at the time, but this guy really shaped. Being a commando it's not about the training. It doesn't define you as a Royal Marine Commando. The analogy is learning to drive. You don't learn to drive until you passed your test. It's the same in the commandos. And Jim was, I didn't realise at the time, but was probably the epitome of what being a Royal Marine Commando was about. Unbelievably professional, as humble as the day is long, as fit as 10 men, a big smile on his face. Nothing fazed him. And it wasn't till about 6 months I realised that everybody in the commander unit pretty much wanted to be in Jim's team. And I was lucky enough to be in it. What a role model to sort of be beside in those early days.
Yeah.
As well as my nan, amazing woman.
Yeah. Great examples. Do you think there's anyone who you owe a conversation to that maybe you're worried you'll never have?
Well, I think I'll be those 2 characters again. My nan,
Right.
I wished I'd had that conversation with her before she passed away about what an influence she was on me in those early days. I remember some of my darkest times in commando training, totally cold, wet, miserable, days without sleep, minimal food, horrific conditions, and thinking about her, really, about how resilient she was. So I would love to have had a conversation. And maybe when I was a young lad, we used to go on holiday with her in Weymouth. She would sort of frog march us down to the Nothe and down to the beach, and my brother and I would just spend all day there with a bamboo cane with a 6-inch nail in it, trying to hunt for flatfish, swimming through the seaweed and God knows what else. And then at the end of the day, we'd go back and she'd make us these incredible dinners. She didn't have much money, top floor. But I do remember realizing that. And I remember often sitting her down and saying, Nan, we'll make you a cup of tea. And I must have been only 10, 11, 12 years old, 9, 10, 11, 12 years old. So I remember consciously thinking, this amazing woman is doing so much for us. What can I give? And the best I could do was make her a nice cup of tea and sit down and put her slippers on and put the black and white TV on. But I suppose she probably would have liked that. Well, I hope so. But I would have loved to have a conversation with her just to say how influential she was and has been and still is on my life.
If everything that you owned disappeared, not just sort of physical stuff, but also, status as well, what would you want to be remembered for? What would the real Dave Pearce want to be remembered for?
I think that loyalty, but measured loyalty, the loyalty to the mission, the purpose, and to the people around you, and for it to be reciprocated. I was chatting to someone and they said, "Oh, I know this guy who knows you, Dave." And I said, "Oh, that's great." And it doesn't matter who it was. But they went on to say that this guy said, "Oh, do you know what? I often think of Dave Pearce in pretty tough situations. And I think if he was here now, what would he do?" And he gives me this slight reassuring presence, even though he's not here. And I was a bit taken back by that, if I'm honest, and, sort of didn't want to discuss it anymore. But I sort of walked away thinking, wow, that was quite a pleasant thing to hear, really. So I suppose that would be the sum of it, that I would hope people would see me as someone who is a giver of information, from all my experiences, and I'm not shy to do that. And that I would hopefully be a reasonable, reassuring presence, particularly in difficult situations.
And what do you think people should worry about less?
Detail.
Health and safety.
Health and safety. Yes. No, I think detail, and I'm being very flippant with that, and I'm being very flippant with the health and safety because I do know many people who do that, and it's a highly important and right thing to do. But I think detail and dwelling on the mishaps, particularly in my case of loyalty, where it hasn't been reciprocated, and I could have sleepless nights over that, but I don't. And I think not worrying about the detail of stuff like that, even if it goes against all your sort of values and everything else, it's pointless, that interfering with your purpose. And I sometimes do think detail does get in the way of good fun.
Yeah. And if someone in the, distant future were to pick up and listen to this conversation between us, what would you want them to take from it? What would you want them to learn from you?
Well, I suppose a number of things, really. I certainly think that sometimes life isn't decent and it can be unfair, but try and remain optimistic. I think be present and grateful for everything we have had. And it's easy for me to say that because I have had some amazing experiences. That said, I've gone out and got them. I've taken a lot of risks, both in my career and my family life, by doing that. So it's quite easy for me to sit here and say, reflect on those experiences and enjoy it. But I think, be grateful for what you have and tell yourself every day how the little things are as important as the big things. And it's not necessarily the material. It's not the house. It's not the car. Like I say, I still drive around in a Renault Scenic, which is I've had for nearly 15 years. And it's not about, I'm not driven by the money or the wealth, or there's bigger factors in the world and as us as human beings, which are way more important.
Look, I think, Dave, you're a guy who's gone out with his arms open and embraced opportunities, embraced other people, embraced a lot of what the world has to offer and found a lot of good in that. And you are one of the few people that I know who I would absolutely trust with my life anywhere and everywhere. And it's been great to share your experiences and insights with you. So thanks so much for your time today.
Tim, back at you. What an amazing thing. I mean, you're a good friend, Tim, and we've had some great experiences, but I'll take you back to the start about comfort zones, and this was stepping out of my comfort zone. It's something I wouldn't normally do. So one, I thank you for allowing me the space to step outside my comfort zone, and you being so diligent, professional, kind, empathetic throughout the whole process, because if it wasn't you, I probably wouldn't do this. So I thank you, Tim. Take care, buddy.
Cheers. Thank you for listening to Echoes Across Time. If this conversation made you pause, reflect, or see legacy in a new way, share it with someone you'd want to remember you by. You can follow the journey and join our community wherever you listen to your podcasts. I'm Tim Levy, reminding you your story is already part of someone else's legacy.